Okay, we'll move ahead with the shoulder joint. I'm going to take a similar formula to last class and try to figure out how the shoulder does something. We will possibly continue with the forearm tomorrow, or maybe do like a little group project and have you do some turning point questions. We'll see. So, shoulder joint. We had just finished our discussion of the shoulder girdle. And being that this computer is a little too weak to be able to broadcast the model in real time while recording and presenting, I made a few short videos. So this one is summarizing what we talked about yesterday to help give you a sense of how everything relates and is organized in situ, in real life, I suppose. So all the ligaments that we talked about, the trapezoid ligament, the conoid ligament, coracoacromial ligaments that anchor that joint of the shoulder girdle. You see medial pec nerve piercing, pec minor. Pec minor, the smallest of the pectoral muscles, which depresses the scapula. So every time the muscle lights up, that's when it's active, that's when it's contracting. So you can see the motion where it depresses the scapula and secures it against the back. Serratus anterior, that serrated saw blade anterior edge, connects along the medial border of the scapula, and there's the long thoracic nerve innervating it. Here's the action. It protracts the scapula. So retract is pull back, protract is pull forward. Again, whenever it lights up, it's active. You can see it protracting the scapula, pushing it against the back of the rib cage and pulling it around to the side. And trapezius, split into three different sections: superior, intermediate, and lower. Fibers running in many different areas gives it many different actions. I'm just showing you the raising of the scapula, raising of the shoulder girdle. And then if we get rid of that, we see the muscles underneath that secured the scapula to the thoracic cavity, thoracic cage. So levator scapulae on each side. The transverse vertebrae of the top few cervical vertebrae to the superior angle of the scapula, that top portion of the medial border. You can see the dorsal scapular nerve was highlighted there briefly. I'll come back to that in a second because that innervates all the muscles in a line along the medial border. I actually chose the wrong motion here initially. It does help with flexion of the neck, but what I wanted to show you was elevation of the scapula. There we go. Shoulder elevation. Levator scapulae, lifting up the scapula. And then just inferior to those, the rhomboids, rhomboid major, under minor. We'll only look at major because they do pretty much the same thing. They retract the scapula. And this is the dorsal scapular nerve highlighted, the path all the way from C5. It passes levator scapulae to innervate them, innervates rhomboid minor and rhomboid major. So you can see the pathway highlighted nicely there, just down the medial border. And if we get rid of the other muscles, you can see the retracting action of the rhomboid muscles. Ooh, even this, the computer's having a hard time doing. The fan's going crazy right now. This series of slides is now 800 megabytes, by the way, after adding these videos. It's pretty, it's a tall order for this old MacBook Air. So that's what we did yesterday. Did that help? Put things into perspective a little bit rather than just hearing me try to describe it colorfully. So I have a few of those sprinkled throughout today's lecture on the shoulder as well, just to highlight some of the static images that you have in your slide set that's on Moodle and that we'll see here. So the shoulder girdle is the foundation for the shoulder joint. And it's between the shoulder girdle and the humerus that the shoulder joint exists. The humerus is the arm bone. There's one bone in the upper arm that articulates with the scapula specifically. But you can think of it as the shoulder girdle because those are tightly anchored together, the clavicle and the scapula. So the humerus is the upper arm bone. Its rounded head, the large rounded head you can see here, articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And then what we'll look at tomorrow is the distal end that articulates with the radius and ulna, the two bones of the forearm. So we're only going to focus on the head of the humerus today, but there are a few pieces of the humerus that are important to note. And so if we take a look, not at this cartoon-ish drawing, but we look at something a bit more detailed, you can see the shoulder girdle, the scapula, and the clavicle, and the head articulating with the glenoid cavity at the shoulder joint. Now, a few features are fairly obvious. They stand out, and they are important landmarks and for points of attachment of some of the muscles of the shoulder joint. First of which is the greater tubercle, the larger of the two prominences at the superior aspect of the humerus. Now, this is most lateral, but it's also just the biggest. The greater tubercle, complemented by the lesser tubercle a bit more medially. And since we're in the area, I'll point out the intertubercular sulcus, or the intertubercular groove. Big, complicated name, but between tubercular tubercles, between the tubercles, and it's a small depression. It's the groove between the two tubercles, and this will become important as we move down through the arm and look at the elbow joint and the forearm. So keep that in the back of your mind, but for today, the deltoid tuberosity is the last important feature of the humerus. You can guess what inserts or what attaches at the deltoid tuberosity, an important muscle for keeping the shoulder joint intact and articulating it, specifically abducting the shoulder, but also flexing and extending. And you get a sense from this picture how fragile the shoulder joint is. Maybe. One long skinny bone attaching with this wide round face just at one very narrow point of contact. The glenoid cavity, the glenoid fossa is fairly shallow. And so it's a miracle that it stays in place as much as it does and it doesn't fall out or dislodge any more often than it does. It doesn't separate or dislocate like is shown here with this fellow's right shoulder, your left as you look at the slide. You can clearly see the acromion poking out, the spine of the scapula. The acromion here as it would meet with the clavicle. Normally that's not so prominent, and you can see that on the right-hand side. Now even this doesn't look too disturbing. It just looks slumped a little bit. But when you look in depth with an X-ray, you get a sense of just how disruptive a dislocation can be. Also notice the small point of contact on the left-hand side, which rightly so you need because this is one of the most labile, movable joints in the body. Wide range of motion. The entire head of the humerus can move across the glenoid cavity, and we'll see that in an animation coming up. But an anterior-inferior dislocation, which is often the most common type, that's what I've had 3 times, pulls the humerus out and down as the strong muscles across the front, the pectoralis major, and the latissimus dorsi below and to the back, pull it down and out. So we'll see those muscles coming out, and you can understand how this motion is more likely to occur than any other form of dislocation. Pretty impressive that it doesn't just come out normally. It's sitting on the edge of the glenoid cavity. What keeps the shoulder joint secure? We're going to start from the bottom and build up. So the joint capsule is a big part of what keeps the shoulder joint together here. And you can't see the capsule properly here, but the ligaments that thicken the capsule are fairly obvious. So the first of which is most superior, the coracohumeral ligament. And if I didn't tell you what 2 points this ligament spanned, you could probably decipher. It likely attaches somewhere on the coracoid process and the humerus. That's true. Specifically, it originates at the base of the coracoid process. You can't see it on this diagram, unfortunately. But if you can look through the coracoid process right about at the level of where my pointer is now at the base, on the back portion, the posterior half, it would originate there and then travel all the way across to the greater tubercle. That secures the shoulder joint superiorly. Across the front, the anterior side, we have a few. There should be another line. There are a few glenohumeral ligaments. So these connect the humerus to the capsule. There's one there, and then this other large one behind the blue bursa is another glenohumeral ligament. So the front surface, the anterior surface, is made up of 2 or 3 of these that thicken the capsule. And those are the major ligaments that hold the shoulder joint together. I'm going to show you or introduce a couple more, but they're not, they don't have as much of a role in securing the shoulder joint. Because I introduced the intertubercular sulcus earlier, you can see there's something in the sulcus right now. You probably know what that is from lab. But there is a ligament that helps to pinch that thing in place, that tendon of a muscle that we'll see coming up, the transverse humeral ligament. It goes across the humerus, between the 2 tubercles, to pinch and secure the tendon of that muscle in place. So there's not a lot of capsule of ligaments that hold the humerus in place. It's kind of as if you're rock climbing and trying to grab onto a really small projection from the rock face in front of you. You're trying to grab just this front protrusion and keeping that in your grasp. In that example, the scapula is my hand and the rock is the humerus. If we look at it in a slightly different way, you can see those ligaments and some other structures that help to secure the shoulder joint. This is a lateral view looking towards the midline. The humerus is out of the way, and you're looking just at the glenoid cavity of the scapula. This is covered in articular cartilage, which allows really smooth motion. Capsule is all this white stuff. But before I get to the capsule, I want to point out a very thin band. You can see a really thin ridge of white around the glenoid cavity, and this is the glenoid labrum. This is the surface that, it's almost like a rim or a ridge around the cavity that helps to try to seat the humerus in place. And this is the structure that I've worn down after 2 or 3 dislocations. As the shoulder blade rubs, the head as it rubs apart or across the edge as it moves forward, anterior and inferior, it wears down the labrum. So every time your shoulder goes back in after a dislocation, there's less labrum to help keep it in place, and it's more likely to slip out, which is really unfortunate. So the labrum is the thin lip all the way around the cavity, and then that white larger circle is the articular capsule. Capsule that surrounds the joint, contains synovial fluid. This is a synovial joint, so it seals the entire joint from the outside. Now the capsule goes all the way around the shoulder joint, but the ligaments that we pointed out do not. So you can see the coracohumeral ligament, a thickening projection just at the top right of this figure. And then the glenohumeral ligaments, you can see 3 layers along the anterior surface. This is anterior and posterior You can see the thickening of the capsule are the ligaments highlighted in this figure. So those are the static structures that try to hold the humerus in place. We haven't even talked about the muscles yet, but you can see how the muscles are trying to wrap around the capsule. And we'll see what those muscles are and what actions they do as we venture into the muscles that move the humerus. Muscles that move the humerus. So we have our foundation. We have the bones, we know the point of contact, and we know the static structures that secure the joint in place. The muscles will assist in securing the joint, but they also will manipulate the joint. And again, from the ground up, starting from the inside out, these muscles are the intrinsic muscles of the shoulder. Many of them make up what you commonly know as the rotator cuff. The first muscle I'm going to point out, sitting in the supraspinous fossa, is supraspinatus. So the name implies the part of where it originates, supraspinatus, on the superior border of the spine. To complement that, infraspinatus in the infraspinous fossa, just below the spine of the scapula. Both of these serve to anchor the humerus, and they're both supplied and innervated by the same sources. So that's why I'm bringing them up together. These are both innervated, so turned on, by the suprascapular nerve. And when I took the time last class to point out the suprascapular notch and the suprascapular ligament, I did that because the suprascapular nerve, same name, is closely associated with that structure. This nerve, we'll see in a video coming up, passes through the notch, under the ligament. It's really interesting because it's a fine detail. And in anybody that you were to look at, developmentally, we're all the same. The nerve is underneath the ligament, and the artery is above. The artery has the same name, suprascapular artery. The suprascapular artery and the suprascapular nerve innervate and supply these two muscles, supraspinatus and infraspinatus. Now, I do list here part of the insertion. They both insert on the greater tubercle of the humerus, but they do so in a different way such that their actions are different. We'll see their actions on the next slide, but just consider supraspinatus along the top, connecting to the superior aspect of the greater tubercle, would serve to abduct the humerus, would abduct the arm, push it up into the side. Whereas infraspinatus, attaching on the posterior aspect of the greater tubercle, you can only see it on the left-hand side, would externally rotate. So two different actions because they attach at slightly different points on the greater tubercle. You'll see the action shortly. Now that external rotation, that's the classic action of the rotator cuff. So infraspinatus is one of the key muscles in that commonly assumed term, that common name. The other one that you can see that wraps around and tries to secure the humerus is teres minor. Very similar path and very similar action to infraspinatus. We're not going to go into detail on the innervation or supply for teres minor. I just want to show you that it parallels infraspinatus so you can imagine what it would do. And lastly, while we have this slide up, the muscle on the opposite surface of the scapula, the anterior surface, we mentioned this last class, subscapularis, covers the entire subscapular fossa and connects to the front of the humerus. So where the rotator cuff muscles externally rotate, you're probably wondering what subscapularis would do. Subscapularis, connecting to the front surface of the humerus, would internally rotate. Right? Shortening, bringing those two borders together, connecting the front of the humerus to the underside of the scapula, would internally rotate. So these intrinsic muscles secure and manipulate the shoulder at the shoulder joint. This is where having a video like this is going to pay off. Because my colorful descriptions will only do so much. But when you see the muscles in place, supraspinatus first, from the supraspinous fossa, infraspinatus just below it, both of them innervated and supplied by the same structures. And if I fade the muscles out for you, you can see them. The suprascapular artery and nerve. Notice the suprascapular ligament. Artery above, nerve underneath. All of you have that same orientation. You can see the muscle or the artery and nerve spread across the supraspinous fossa. And I'm just going to take it back for a second. And around the wing of the scapula into the infraspinous fossa. Same artery and nerve. I described the actions of supraspinatus, but here you see it in action. It's drawing the supraspinous fossa and the greater tubercle together. So we get that abduction at the shoulder. And infraspinatus, slightly different because it attaches a little bit lower, still on the greater tubercle, but its job is to externally rotate. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then this video is worth, what, 10,000? More than that? And I thought my words did a pretty good job of describing it. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, you can see teres minor. We're not going to look in depth at what it does. Just look at the pathway. It parallels infraspinatus, attaches just below it on the greater tubercle. Well, I guess we are going to look at it. It would also help to externally rotate, being that it's part of the rotator cuff. And the last muscle that we want to look at in this section, subscapularis, which we can really access well from the front. You can see it on the anterior surface. The anterior surface of the scapula, it dives forward, attaches on the anterior part of the humerus. Don't worry about the nervous innervation or the arterial supply, but do look at the action. It internally rotates, drawing the anterior surface closer to the subscapular fossa. So the intrinsic muscles of the shoulder joint. They're not large, they're not powerful, but they help to secure the shoulder and do a lot of fine motor movements. So before I move on, questions about those small muscles? Is it pretty clear the actions that they do and what I want you to know? Is it too repetitive? Yeah, question? Okay, so how to tell the difference when looking posteriorly between these two muscles. The easiest way is the size. Infraspinatus and teres minor, largely different sizes. Infraspinatus very large, teres minor very small. Infraspinatus also covers the majority of the infraspinous fossa, so it gets its name from its origin. Otherwise, remembering the sequence. Teres minor has a counterpart, teres major, that we haven't seen yet, that we're going to come up with. And they're always listed in the same order. So infraspinatus, most superiorly, teres minor, just inferior, and then teres major would show up right underneath. It's a fairly large muscle belly. So sizes are one, the order of attachments is another, although they do similar actions, if that helps. Good question. So if it's not too repetitive, we'll look at some of the larger muscles and do another animated example. So we've built the intrinsic muscles of the shoulder, and now we're moving out a layer to a muscle that's cut away in this section, the pectoralis major. You can see pectoralis minor that we talked about in depth in securing the shoulder girdle. Now imagine that this cut border wasn't cut and extended all the way across. This open flap on the left-hand side is where pectoralis major would connect on the humerus. So pectoralis major spans the entire chest region all the way across and connects on the humerus. So it has actions in, well, we'll see the actions coming up. Pectoralis major, innervated by the medial and lateral pec nerves. Medial pec nerve we've seen before. That's the one that pierces pec minor. It's not shown here, but it runs right through the middle of the muscle belly. And the lateral pec nerve, I'm going to wait to tell you about it till you can see it, but they're named because they come off of the medial and lateral cords of the brachial plexus. They're not named for where they travel, they're named for where they arise in the brachial plexus. Don't worry about blood supply. Know that the attachment point over here is just below the greater tubercle on what we call the crest of the greater tubercle. It's a ridge that comes down from the greater tubercle. So internal rotation, transverse adduction, we'll look at the actions of pectoralis major in the video. It's easier to see it than to describe it. So pectoralis major, the biggest muscle on the front of the shoulder, the deltoid muscle, the biggest muscle on the lateral aspect, and probably the posterior aspect of the shoulder as well. Deltoid is the muscle of the shoulder. It covers all aspects. Front, side, back, anterior, lateral, posterior aspects of the shoulder joint. And the deltoid muscle, innervated by the axillary nerve on top all alone, easy to be seen and to be shown. And the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. The pathway of this nerve is really interesting, and you can't see it here. You will see it coming up, but the pathway of this nerve and the pathway of the arteries that supply the deltoid are very interesting. Very interesting in a dry anatomical sense. Very interesting in that everything else is cut and dry, boring, mundane. This is an interesting passageway or feature that we noticed, and so we thought it was kind of quirky. The supply, the arterial blood supply, are by circumflex humeral arteries. What does that mean? Circumflex humeral arteries. The name implies that these arteries run around the humerus. Circumflex humeral arteries. There are two branches, one in front, one behind, and coming from the axilla, the armpit area, they run around the humerus in front and around the humerus behind to hug the humerus and supply the deltoid with blood. Anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. I always abbreviate these two, ACHA and PCHA, because it's easier to say that. And lastly, the deltoid inserts on the deltoid tuberosity, as you probably guessed when we saw that first slide in class. The deltoid tuberosity, midway down the lateral aspect of the humerus. Now, the deltoid is generally broken up into three parts. There's the clavicular part, the acromial part, and the spinous or scapular part. We'll get to that in a second, though. So, pectoralis major, the largest muscle on the front of the chest. You can see it here, not cut away, inserting on the crest of the greater tubercle over on the humerus. And the actions would be many. Here you can see transverse adduction, the bench press motion, transverse in the transverse plane, adduction towards the midline. Whenever the muscle lights up, it's on, it's contracting. There are other actions, but that's the major action that we are going to use to identify pectoralis major. Here you can see the nerves supplying pectoralis major. I didn't fade the muscle, so it's hard to see it, but you can look in from behind the medial and lateral pectoral nerves. Pectoralis minor is not there to see which one pierces, but I'll assume that you know that right now. Deltoid muscle, on the other hand, and this is where we get a real sense of the precariousness of the shoulder joint. Notice the three parts. It completely encircles the shoulder girdle. Clavicle, acromion, spine of the scapula. Completely encircles the shoulder girdle. And all the fibers converge at the deltoid tuberosity at the point of the deltoid. And so being that this has such a large muscle belly in many different areas, it's going to flex, it's going to extend, and it's going to abduct the shoulder. Abduct, take away from the midline, lifting the arm up and to the side, drawing the deltoid tuberosity towards the acromion, and then look underneath at the range of motion of the head of the humerus. Look at how precarious that is. How do you raise your hand in class to ask a question without the humerus falling out? Deltoid muscle, innervated by the axillary nerve, and it says more on the slide, but we'll call it the axillary nerve. And you can start to see the posterior circumflex humeral artery there as well. And let me just pause it right here. So the light blue highlighted area is the axillary nerve. It comes through this little opening and then innervates the deltoid. This red conduit is the posterior circumflex humeral artery. It wraps around the back of the humerus. It also comes through this little hole. And that little hole is the cool aspect that we noticed. This is called the quadrangular space. Quadrangular space. I guess square or rectangular space wasn't interesting enough. Quadrangular space, there are four sides to it, and the four sides will be important. We're not going to look at the four sides right now, only to say that there is an opening bordered by two muscles, top and bottom, and then tendons of two muscles, left and right. And that space will always contain PCHA and the axillary nerve. So that's one way to figure out what artery and nerve you're looking at. If they're going through this square space, PCHA and the axillary nerve. Incidentally, yeah, maybe I'll leave it. I'm not going to push my luck. I won't name the things that make the borders yet. We'll just call it the quadrangular space. But a little square with those two structures passing through it. I think that's it. Yeah. I just got creative with the animations at the end. So that leaves the posterior aspect of the shoulder joint. Two muscles that we want to look at quickly before we round out our discussion of the musculature of the shoulder joint. And one that's been suspiciously absent. Suspicious because it's one of the largest muscles in the body, latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi does a lot of actions in adducting the humerus, returning the humerus to the midline. The large fan-shaped muscles along the back that originate from some fascia and connective tissue and the spinous processes of the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. In the animation, I show you the thoracodorsal nerve and the thoracodorsal artery. You've heard these names before as well when we talked about the brachial plexus, but I'm not going to focus on the nerve and artery supply for latissimus dorsi very much. Just know thoracodorsal, thorax, and the back. They are innervated and supplied by those structures, but I'm not going to really test you on that. What is worth noting is the path of latissimus dorsi. So however it's innervated or supplied, it starts all along the back, the dorsal portion of the thoracic cage, and the abdominal cavity. And it dives anterior under the humerus and inserts at the intertubercular sulcus. So from the back, the large wing-shaped muscle loops underneath the arm, through the armpit, through the axilla, and then inserts on the front of the humerus. It's an odd path for it to take. And being one of the larger muscles, being that it's quite strong with a large muscle belly, it would probably have pretty strong actions at the shoulder. That's why if you've ever done a lat pull down at the gym, and you're starting to feel a little fatigued, and you do your lat pull down, and of course you're doing it in front of the head because it's the correct way to do it, not behind the back where your shoulders are really prone. When you bring the bar down and you're just trying to squeeze out the last little bit of range of motion, you tend to round your shoulders a bit. You're not supposed to, but you want to when you do that last little push in your lat pull down. And that's because the latissimus is trying to pull or internally rotate your humerus. It's trying to pull your humerus down and in. So I'll show you that animation in a second. The other muscle that's on the back that we haven't talked about yet is fairly large, teres major over on the right-hand side. Teres major is the complement to teres minor. Teres major arises from that same inferior border region, just below the infraspinous fossa. And it takes a similar path to latissimus. It dives under the humerus towards the front of the humerus. So you can see the complicated words, the origin, the posterior aspect of the inferior angle of the scapula. So the back surface of the lowest part of the medial border of the scapula. And it dives forward in front of the humerus and attaches to the lesser tubercle. What does that look like in practice? I talk about diving forward and attaching to the front, but the picture is only a posterior view. You can't really see the path of these muscles until we get the animation going in full time. So, latissimus dorsi, one of the larger muscle groups, innervated by the thoracodorsal nerve, supplied by the thoracodorsal artery. But now, get a sense of the pathway of this muscle. You can see the highlighted portion in the intertubercular sulcus right there. All the way from the back, converging on one single point at the front of the humerus. Of course, as a large muscle belly with fibers in various directions, it will have a lot of actions, but adduction, returning the humerus to the midline, is a big one. This is the action of that lat pull down. I do show you the nerve, thoracodorsal, coming off of the brachial plexus, the posterior cord, running with the long thoracic, but don't pay much attention to that. It's fine for now. I actually think that I even go in and show you the arterial supply. Let's make this an FYI. It's kind of neat to see the arterial supply. Being such a large muscle, there need to be a lot of arteries that supply the muscle. You can see the thoracodorsal artery up here, a branch off of the subclavian artery. And then intercostal arteries also supplying latissimus dorsi in the lumbar region. Anyways, let's leave that for now and turn our attention to teres major. Teres major, similar pathway towards the front of the humerus from the inferior angle of the scapula in front of the triceps towards the front of the humerus. You can see it acting to internally rotate. Teres major also has actions to adduct. It will do this. It will also contract when you're doing the lat pull down type activity, but the latissimus is by far the prime mover during that action. Now let me just go back real quick. Since we took the time to introduce teres major and teres minor, there's a good shot. Notice quadrangular space, axillary nerve, PCHA. The superior border is teres minor, inferior border, teres major. So the two teres muscles set two of the borders of the quadrangular space. That square opening is an opening between teres minor on top and teres major on the bottom. The other two borders we don't know yet, but you can probably guess what they are just by looking at the image. So quadrangular space shows you where the axillary nerve and the posterior circumflex humeral artery pass. The upper border is teres minor, lower border is teres major. So if I were summarizing this work and trying to put a functional spin on it, one of the questions I might ask is, how is the humerus abducted at the shoulder? This is one of many possible actions. You could ask how the humerus is internally rotated or externally rotated, but if I'm looking at how the humerus is abducted, I want to know the foundation of the shoulder joint. The point of contact is the humerus at the scapula, specifically at the glenoid cavity. The things that hold those two bones in place are the articular capsule, the glenohumeral ligaments. They secure the joint. They help to secure that synovial joint. The coracohumeral ligament is not on there, but that's the superior ligament that also secures the joint. To abduct the muscle, the two muscles that are involved would be supraspinatus and the acromial part of the deltoid muscle. Those are the only two muscles that attach to the superior surface of the humerus. Supraspinatus, remember, from the supraspinous fossa to the greater tubercle of the humerus, draws those 2 points together and initiates abduction. Supraspinatus was one of the muscles that was innervated by the suprascapular nerve, supplied by the suprascapular artery. Both of those features pass through or near the suprascapular notch, artery above, nerve underneath, always. The other muscle that was supplied by those structures was infraspinatus, but it doesn't have a role in abducting the shoulder, so it's not included here. The second muscle that works to abduct the humerus is the deltoid muscle, specifically the acromial part, the middle portion of the deltoid. If supraspinatus initiates abduction, the deltoid completes abduction, allowing full range of motion of the arm up and to the side, away from the midline. Deltoid muscle, all of it, innervated by the axillary nerve, supplied by the posterior circumflex humeral artery, both of which travel through the quadrangular space. And the actions of that muscle, simple, bringing the acromion and the deltoid tuberosity closer together. So supraspinatus initiates contraction, drawing the greater tubercle closer to the supraspinous fossa, and then the deltoid muscle completes abduction. For abduction, this is it. It is worth mentioning other muscles will be active. They might not be active in the role of abduction, but they are certainly active in securing the shoulder joint. So it's not like you will turn off infraspinatus or turn off teres major or turn off subscapularis. Those muscles will still be active to seat the humerus and the glenoid fossa. But they're not a focus when the question is, how is the humerus abducted at the shoulder? So same information, repackaged in a slightly different way with a functional spin. This is to achieve the goal of abduction. So we're going to move on to the upper limb tomorrow. We'll do something like this, where you have a functional task that you want to achieve, and your job then is to identify the structures involved, the muscles, their innervation supply, how they move to achieve that function.